Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight it gives me great pleasure to talk about Silent Running on Blu-ray. Silent Running came out in 1972 and it was directed by Douglas Trumbull, and it was written by Deric Washburn, Michael Cimino, and Stephen Bochio. So this particular movie is something that has a lot of staying power for those who have seen it over the years, especially as a work of environmentalist science fiction. And the first time I saw it, I think I was in junior high, but I remember that my dad and my stepmom had rented it from Blockbuster because my dad had seen it a long time ago. But it was on VHS, and we all three of us watched it one night. And I remember at the time, I thought it was maybe a little too preachy, but there were some things I liked about it. But fast forward to say, when I'm in junior college and I see the film again, and this time it's on DVD. I came to appreciate it a whole lot more. And I think that, having some real world experience, life experience, and what have you, and having a better understanding of just how, much, man has kind of, screwed with the environment over the years. The message of the film, maybe an execution is a little bit preachy at times, but there's a definite sincerity to it that's coming from a very real place. And the message itself is something that, is worth, listening to, and, is something that, should be at least, thought about, by those who, watch the movie. And also, I think that, the lead performance by Bruce Dern is something that elevates the film to a point where it's like, even if, say, one's not an avid science fiction fan, the sheer humanity that's, conveyed in Bruce Dern's performance is something that, carries the movie in a lot of ways. But if you're a sci-fi fan, though, there are some neat things about it that make this film distinguishable from other films of its ilk. But the way the movie that got started was Universal Studios had seen the success of the movie Easy Rider, which came out in 1969, and it was directed by Dennis Hopper, who also starred in it, and also starred Peter Fonda as well. And I haven't actually seen Easy Rider, but by most accounts, I've heard that it's kind of a signature counterculture film, and it's something that came out at a point in time where society was really starting to question authority, because you had the abuse of power by the government, and amongst other things you had the Vietnam War and things like that. So people were like, well, if those in power are doing all these horrible things, what's the use of following authority? If authority is going to screw us over, why are we even bothering with this? And so basically people trying to find their own way in a landscape of shifting ideology, and so it's one of those movies that it's like, we've all seen movies like this. Even, like I said, I haven't seen Easy Rider, but I've seen films that come from a place like that, though. And so it was a hit, okay? And so the studio bigwigs, they're kind of like, they may, whether or not they agreed with what the film was saying, they saw that it was successful. And so basically they're like, hey, hippie films are in, and young independent hotshot filmmakers are in, so let's kind of get in on this. And so Universal Studios had this 5-picture deal wherein they would take 5 movies and give each one a budget of $1 million, and each film would be directed by a relatively new filmmaker, someone who is fresh fish, so to speak. And basically Universal Studios would sort of have a hands-off policy as far as their interference with these films. They would give each director of each film a certain amount of considerable artistic freedom. And so Two of these films were Dennis Hopper's The Last Movie and George Lucas's American Graffiti. And so the last movie, from what I understand, did not do well, and it's shown up in a few books, such as you know, like things that talk about Hollywood bombs and things like that. But on the other hand, I can honestly say that George Lucas's American Graffiti was a very good film, and I wish that with respect to, say, Star Wars, I really wish that George Lucas had done more films like American Graffiti, because it showed that he had skills as a director. But for the purpose of doing this review, though, Silent Running was another one of those 5 films in this 5-picture deal. And so Douglas Trumbull had a background in special effects, and his father had actually worked on special effects in the original Wizard of Oz film, and so special effects ran in his family. But he had just gotten off of doing the special effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey, and so he hadn't had any history with directing, but he ended up being one of the people who was given an opportunity to direct a film in this 5-picture deal that Universal had, and Silent Running ended up being the film that he worked on, and that was his debut as a filmmaker. And so he had a lot to do with the film's special effects, and he still worked heavily with the special effects department and everything, but at the same time he showed a lot of promise as a director too. And the screenplay is something that was rather interesting, in a sense that you had the initial screenplay, which was written by Deric Washburn and Michael Cimino. And I'll get into what that particular screenplay conveyed maybe a little later in this review. But the interesting thing about that one is that both Deric Washburn and Michael Cimino would later go on to collaborate on the movie The Deer Hunter. So there you go. But Stephen Bochio basically kind of came in and sort of tied their elements together, and added his own contribution to the movie. And what we ended up getting was a film that had an environmentalist message, but also a very humanistic story, with a very well developed and tragic protagonist. So watching this movie again, for the first time, since junior college, specifically watching it on this Arrow Video release, it brought back a lot of memories, and the film still holds up, and I came away appreciating it a whole lot more. And Bruce Dern's performance is still haunting, and of course the sci-fi elements of the film are things that elevate it and make it stand out within the sci-fi genre. But as a Arrow Video release, it's a pretty good release, in the sense that this Blu-ray comes loaded with a bunch of bonus material. And so some of these special features are kind of holdovers from the DVD release from way back in the day, but a lot of the bonus features are brand new, or I should say were brand new at the time of this Blu-ray's release, which was in 2020. But I was fortunate enough to get this Blu-ray, with a mother of an Amazon gift card, and so I didn't have to spend any of my own money on it. But yeah, so I was very happy to learn that Silent Running was getting the Arrow Video treatment, because Arrow Video, they're kind of like the Criterion collection, in the sense that they re-released movies of various genres, such as action, science fiction, horror, and fantasy. But these re-releases will be chock full of bonus material. And so if you're a fan of whatever the film is, I mean, you're going to get an inside look on things in more ways than one. And so it's like the people who, worked at Arrow Video, I mean, they're passionate about films and, and the history of films. And so, anything that they're releasing, whether or not you think it's a good movie, it's going to be a good release. So, Silent Running, in this case, is a good movie and a good, release on Blu-ray. So, let's go ahead and get into it. The story, takes place in the distant future, and Earth is not doing well at all. In fact, I mean, things are so bad environmentally that all the plant life has, died out. All the oceans have dried up. And so, there's a certain amount of stagnation on the planet, and humanity is at a point where, they've become very complacent about, living, because it's like the environment's, died out or it's dying out. And, the point of living, is called into question, just by humanity in general. But, the various, forms of authority have implemented a space program which is conducting an experiment, wherein the very last, pieces of flora and fauna are contained in a series of environmental domes on these, cargo transport ships that are in, the orbit of Saturn. And so basically there's this, long-term experiment that, that is being conducted, wherein, they're trying to, see if the environment, can thrive and possibly be, brought back to Earth, and, maybe over time, nature can be restored. And so the focus of the film is on a spaceship called the Valley Forge, and the Valley Forge is one of 8 of these, cargo transport ships, and each ship has about 6 biodomes, 6 gardens, if you will. And on the Valley Forge, is the character of Freeman Lowell. It's played by Bruce Dern, and he's sort of the head garden researcher, the head botanist. He's the guy who is basically the expert on handling the plant life, the animal life, and things like that. And his fellow crew members are 3 other individuals, but they're more along the lines of, hey, they're just, working on the ship. They make sure the ship's running okay. And, they kind of resent, being there because, they all kind of, volunteered for their own reasons and what have you. But Freeman, though, is the only one who is, taking the responsibility of the experiment seriously, as far as, he's, of the 4 of them, he's the only one who's actually, trying to see to it that the environment thrives under his care. Any dome he's going to, I mean, he's checking on it. The plant life there, he's checking on the animals and make sure everything's going okay. And he really comes to fall in love with nature, in his time, as part of this experiment. Whereas the other 3 guys, I mean, they take their responsibilities seriously too, but they don't really see much of a point in, I guess, in their eyes, prolonging, nature's inevitable demise. Because as far as they're concerned, I mean, nature was already on its way out, and this was just a last-ditch effort by some anonymous company bigwigs to maybe shake a few more leaves from the tree, so to speak. But they sort of butt heads with Lowell from time to time. I mean, they don't necessarily hate each other, but at the same time, there is a certain amount of conflict that arises from their differing ideologies. I mean, because Freeman, I mean, he's come to value nature and how beautiful it is, and how beautiful Earth once was as well. And he's trying to explain to them that, I mean, look at look at what humanity has become. I mean, we're so stagnant and complacent. I mean, we've lost the ability to dream. And it even applies to his fellow crew members, because they can't really, they don't really seem to want to think beyond their material convenience and things like that. And in fact, as far as food and stuff like that goes, I mean, they predominantly eat sort of synthetic food. I mean, that seems to be the prevailing form of food, as far as what's on Earth, because all the plant life's died and everything. Whereas Freeman, though, I mean, he makes a point to try and make food that is grown from the various gardens from these biodomes. And so he's trying to explain to him that he prefers eating something that he's actually grown versus the synthetic food that they're constantly chowing down on, that has no heart to it or anything like that. But also, the crew is assisted by these three robotic drones, that do maintenance on the ship and other functions as well. So this crew of four people and three robotic drones, I mean, they've been on this mission for quite some time, and and there's word of some sort of ship, some sort of mass group communication that's going to be coming up soon. And Freeman is convinced that just based on his communications with those in charge of this mission, he's convinced that with the data that he's been able to provide them, as well as the data from the gardeners on the other ships, I mean, he's convinced that the company is going to make the decision to have the ships come, or recall the ships back to Earth, and have these biodomes reinstated to where Earth will be able, like, they'll be brought back to Earth to where over time Earth's ecosystem can start thriving again, since they've proven that with adequate care these gardens can still survive. But unfortunately, though, when the communication does come, it's with the order to jettison the biodomes and blow them up, because the company bigwigs are wanting to recall the cargo transport ships back for space exploration, and transport missions outside of these experiments. And so basically the whole idea of trying to preserve the flora and fauna is deemed irrelevant and a waste of time and resources. And so yeah, all the gardens are going to be blown up, and it's basically company orders. And so this devastates Lowell, and he was already someone who was becoming a bit zealous in his beliefs and his passion for preserving nature. And the fact that he was with some people that while they weren't exactly enemies or anything like that, they didn't really see the point of preserving nature. And so there was constantly clashing, and that was kind of taking a toll on him. And so then these orders come down, and they're being told to literally destroy the last few bits of nature that man has. every ship gets the order, and as far as he can tell, he's the only one who, cares about these gardens. And so while all the other ships, once, the appointed time comes, once all the other ships, they start disengaging, the biodomes and, detonating them with these nuclear, explosives. And once they've gotten a safe distance away from, the ships. And so on the Valley Forge, Freeman tries in vain to, persuade his fellow crew members not to go through with this, because once they do this, I mean, there's no coming back from it. I mean, the gardens are irreplaceable, and he's trying to point out that if they do this, then no one on Earth, I mean, other than themselves, no one on Earth will ever be able to experience the sheer beauty of nature ever again. And so of course the other three are just kind of like, hey, we're on a bit of a timetable here. I mean, come on, get out of the way, and let us do our jobs, and you do your job too. I mean, you know what you signed on for. And so I mean, yeah, he signed on for this experiment, but he was wanting it to succeed. I mean, he was wanting nature to have a second chance, and he was wanting Earth to have a second chance to, bring nature back. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. And so, he just, snaps. And as the, domes are being jettisoned from the Valley Forge and being, blown up one by one, it comes down to one last dome is left, and so actually there's two domes that are left, and so two of the crew members are in one of the domes, setting up an explosive device, and or the nuclear explosive device, and the other crew member is coming to the dome where Freeman is. And so he's saying, hey, I know how you feel, but we've got to do this. I mean, we have our orders. But Freeman's basically staying there with shovel, saying you're not going to do this. I mean, if you know how I feel, you're not going to do this. You wouldn't be doing this right now. You're not going to destroy my forest. And so the guy's like, dude, get out of the way. We've got a job to do. And so unfortunately a fight breaks out, and it's a brief but brutal one, in the sense that his fellow crew member hurts him rather badly, hurts one of his legs rather badly, to a point where it's cut up and bleeding profusely. But Freeman, though, ends up strangling the guy to death with the shovel. He's pressing it down on the guy's neck and just breaks it. And he's at this point he's sort of hobbling over to the systems on the ship that are in charge of launching the domes, and he and he sets it up to where the dome with his other two crew members is jettisoned down to space with them still in it, and he hits the button that sets off the explosive device, and so that dome's destroyed along with the other two crew members. And so now it's just Freeman and the three drones that are on the ship for doing maintenance. And so realizing what he's just done, he makes an effort to retreat from the rest of the ships, and he basically heads towards the rings of Saturn, and to the planet's dark side, and basically tries to set it up to where he fakes the destruction of the ship, and like he has some of the cargo containers jettisoned to make it look like the ship met with misfortune, and so for a time is able to, live out, his dream of, caring, for the forest. In this case, the literal last forest, left from Earth. And so he has the drones, though. He reprograms them to, not only do ship maintenance, but also to um, be able to, patch up his leg, because he was limping around and kind of dragging himself, and because of how badly he was injured. But they, with the new programming, they're able to, surgically repair his leg. And then, he, upgrades their programming a little further, and, names them Huey, Dewey, and Louie, to sort of, have some form of, contact with something other than himself, because, I mean, he's, murdered his crew members, but while he had no great love for them, he didn't hate them either, but it was just kind of a he at the moment. And as, time goes on, I mean, he is, continuing to, do his best to care for the garden, and he's, trying to, you know, see to it that the drones, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, know how to take care of the garden as well, along with their, usual ship maintenance responsibilities. But unfortunately, though, the reality of what he's done kind of, begins to catch up to him, and he realizes that, he's, just murdered, three people, and three people that he, came to know over the years that, he was on board the ship with them. And no great love lost, but at the same time, he realizes that he did something really bad. And so, I mean, the guilt starts to get at him. And, then, the reality of, being the shepherd and steward of the last, bit of, nature, sort of starts to sink in. Because, I mean, yes, I mean, he's very well trained in, maintaining, the garden and everything, and the plant, the flora and fauna. But unfortunately, though, I mean, nature has its own set of complications. And, when that starts to sink in, it just kind of adds to his inner turmoil. And, it's only a matter of time, before, he, comes to the conclusion that he can't, run anymore. But that being the setup, though, this was a very powerful film. I hesitate to call it a masterpiece, but it is a powerful film. And, Bruce Dern, I mean, just knocks it out of the park, and some might argue carries the movie, simply with, his very nuanced, emotional, very, very well thought out performance, because he's playing someone who, has a very, sympathetic, goal. I mean, his reasoning for what he's done is valid, because in light of the setting here, these gardens are literally the last bits of, nature that Earth had. And so the fact that, some anonymous, government, stooge, or, government, bodies has, nonchalantly given the order to just, blow the gardens up without any reason, is something that, basically just screams insanity to him. And so he's someone that you get the feeling was already starting to, have some sort of, mental breakdown in some ways. I mean, because it's like, he's under the strain of trying to care for, these gardens and preserve them, since they're literally the last, bits of nature that Earth has. And when he's with a crew of people that, while not exactly enemies, I mean, they're also not exactly, going out of their way to, say, help him out in, protecting and preserving nature. And they don't really care about nature. It's like, hey, this is just a job we signed up for. We just want to go home. And they're actually happy when the news comes down that, all the domes are to be destroyed. And so, I mean, when he's faced with the reality of, what Earth may have once been with nature being present, I mean, he's just catching a glimpse of it, just in his time, working on in the gardens and everything. And, and he's, convinced that, if, you know, if, if humanity just gave it all a chance, I mean, they'd be able to bring the gardens back, and over time, maybe, restore, the balance and everything. Um, but unfortunately, though, he seems to be the only one who wants to, give things a chance. And so the fact that, he's at the mercy of, an anonymous, or seemingly anonymous, corporate, body that's, giving the orders is something that, basically just sort of, adds to the mental turmoil. And so, once the gardens, start being jettisoned from the ships and, being destroyed, it just breaks him, to a point where he feels he has to make a stand. And so, considering that, the gardens are, specifically the garden that, he defends, is the last garden that Earth has. I mean, you kind of understand why he's doing what he's doing. But unfortunately, I mean, the fact that he resorts to murder, to, you know, carry out, his goal, is something that puts him in the category of, villain protagonist, unfortunately. A sympathetic villain protagonist, but villain protagonist nonetheless. But I mean, we really, get to see, a man who, has, noble intentions and is coming from a place of genuine sincerity, but is unfortunately just, broken by, forces outside of his control. And in that breakdown, I mean, he makes a terrible choice to, kill his, fellow crew members. And so, when we see that, when it comes to that, we understand why he's doing what he's doing, but there is a horror that comes from the act of murder, even if we sympathize with this man. And so, as the movie goes on, I think that Bruce Dern did a really good job of showing how, not only was the guilt of what he was doing, what he had done, was the guilt catching up to him, but also, just the reality of the situation. I mean, yes, I mean, yet he's, he's a trained, qualified professional in terms of, say, caring for the gardens and the wildlife and everything. But at the same time, this was kind of a team effort. And since, there are no other, crew members that he can rely on, he's having to improvise with, the drones, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, and they're able to, help him to some degree, but they can't do what, his fellow crew members, could do. And, he's just one man. And so when things start to, break down, I mean, it just, rattles him even more. And it's like he's trying so hard to, preserve this garden and just, give it a chance. And because this is literally the last bit of nature that's, left from Earth. But, the fact that nature itself is unpredictable, is something that, works against him, and, just, puts him into even more of a downward mental spiral. And so, I mean, Bruce Dern, he's always been, good at playing, I guess you could say, villainous characters. I mean, he was very memorable in the John Wayne movie, The Cowboys. And if you've seen that movie, you know what I'm talking about. But this was a movie, though, that made it to where it's like, I mean, yes, technically he's a villain protagonist, but he's not a monster, though. I mean, he's not an evil person. He's just someone who was trying to do, what he thought was the right thing, and arguably would be the right thing, in a sense of literally trying to preserve, the last piece of nature that Earth has. But, the means they, resorts to, while maybe understandable as a heat of the moment act, they are something that, puts him in the, category of villain, unfortunately. And so I thought that Bruce Dern here give a very nuanced performance of that type of character. And there are some moments that he has where lines of dialogue he delivers, I mean, they really hit home. Like there's the point where shortly after they get the orders to destroy the gardens, they're in they're in the mess hall or dining room, whatever you want to call it, and the other crew members are sort of joking about the whole thing, and they're talking about how eager they are to get home, and they can't wait to do the job that that they're being ordered to do. And so one of the crew members at least tries to talk the other guys down and say, hey, come on, go easy on them, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, though, it's at the end of the day, they all just want to do the job and go home. And so there's a moment though where he's telling them to look on the wall behind him, because there's this kind of collage of photographs from Earth, and there's a picture of a little girl, and he's saying, you look at that girl right there. I know you've seen her before, but you know what she's never going to be able to experience? She's never going to be able to experience the simple beauty of holding a leaf in her hand, because there won't be any trees left. Now you think about that. Now obviously Bruce Dern delivered it much better than I just did, but it's a very powerful moment though. I mean, because it's one of those moments where you just if you have anything resembling a heart, I mean, or a brain, it hits home, and you think about it, and so it's like, what would it be like if you're a little kid and you never get to experience the beauty of the natural world because someone thought, hey, it doesn't matter, let's just blow it all up. And there's another bit where he's at the point where he's become really guilt-stricken by what he's done, by killing his fellow crew members, and he has the 3 drones dig a hole, kind of a makeshift grave, and bury the crew member that he himself killed. And and so it's like they're the 3 drones, the way they're positioned, it's like they're mourners at a funeral, except they're just robots. But he's watching from the computer monitors, and he's he's trying to think of something to say to honor the guy, to honor the guy's passing. And he even admits to himself that he didn't hate them, he didn't hate his fellow crew members, but at the same time they gave him no choice, at least in his mind. But he gets to a point where he says that he wants to say a prayer, but he doesn't think he can, he doesn't know how to. And the sheer emotion that Bruce Dern is giving off, I mean, it's something that it's very moving. And it's like Bruce Dern's at the point where, or Freeman Lowell, as played by Bruce Dern, is at the point where he's basically tearing up, and it's a very, very sad, very human moment, and it feels very real. And that's something that really got to me too. I mean, that scene and the bit where he's asking the guys to imagine the girl not being able to experience the beauty of holding a leaf in her hand. I mean, there was a lot of moments in the film where Bruce Dern just nails it, and his character stays with you. Whether or not you agree with what he did, I mean, the fact that we're seeing this man be kind of broken down and having to come to terms with the reality of the situation, I mean, it's in this albeit somewhat fantastical setting, is something that definitely gives the film a very human element. And so yeah, the production values on this film are actually top notch too. And you look at it, and it's hard to believe that it was made for just $1 million, because it's like everything looks top notch as far as the production design, like how the ships look and everything, because you have the models of the ship that were constructed, of course, or the ship models that were constructed, but then you have like when you have these shots towards the beginning of the film where you see like the exterior shots of the ship, and you see like the camera's kind of going over the ship and everything, and you see like all the domes. I mean, it's a pretty impressive visual moment. And with the score by Peter Schickele, I hope I'm saying the guy's name right. It's a very rousing score, and it's a score that when it comes to visual moments like that, when you're seeing the ships in all their glory for the first time, it's very inspiring. Tapping into, say, the I guess you could say the more awesome elements of science fiction. But then, of course, when it comes to, say, the moments where Freeman is having to face the reality of what he's done, the music takes on a more ominous or tragic tone. But then you also have the songs. There's like 2 songs in the film that were sung by Joan Baez. I hope I'm saying her name right. But yeah, the song "Rejoice in the Sun," I mean, is something that is just heartbreakingly beautiful, and it's yet another element of the film that stays with you, and it conveys the themes of the movie very well, and so and it kind of goes hand in hand with the passionate, compelling performance of Bruce Dern. So it's like the music of the film goes hand in hand with what's going on with the main character. Also, the drones, the way they were brought to life was very impressive too, because they look like sort of walking computers, like walking bulky old school computers with 2 legs, if you can imagine that. And as the film goes on, each of the drones, they do seem to develop a bit of a personality. And now, how much of that is because of Freeman's reprogramming of them, or how much of that is, okay, were these drones somewhat sentient the whole time, and that sentience was being becoming more visible as the film went on, since we're seeing things from one person's perspective, and there's more of an intimate focus? Or is this something where because Freeman is so desperate for companionship, and from out of sheer loneliness, anthropomorphizes however you say that darn word, basically bringing sort of adding human characteristics to an inanimate object, and treating it as if it's a living thing. I mean, is this just a byproduct of Freeman seeing them in that way, and just out of sheer loneliness, and maybe because he's seeing that, we're seeing that? Or is there actually some kind of sentience that came about because of his reprogramming of them? I like that there was some ambiguity in that regard, but like you have the one of the few bright spots in the movie as far as comedy goes, because there's not a lot of comedy here. But one of the moments though comes when he once again reprograms the drones to be able to play a game of poker with him, because that was something that he and his crew members, that was one of the few things that they all like to do together. They actually had some fun doing it, as a group and everything. And so at one point he reprograms the drones to play a game of poker with him. And, there comes a point where he catches, them talking to each other. And mind you, the way they talk, it's like in a series of like, flashing lights and moving parts on their bodies, and it's like showing some form of communication between the 2 of them. And he's like, hey, no talking, no, y'all can't you can't show each other your cards. You can't tell each other what you're trying to do. That's cheating. And so, you have moments like that, and I mean, it's definitely a funny moment when you see them playing poker with him, but it sort of adds to the idea that if they weren't sentient before, then perhaps Freeman's tampering with them just to sort of give them some sense of identity, so that way he wouldn't be so lonely. That may have triggered some form of developing sentience. And so I thought that was interesting. Like, they didn't come right out and say it, but they showed enough to give you um, give the the arguments credence either way. So if you want to consider them as developing sentience over time, or the fact that they're not sentient, but he's just so desperate for companionship that he's projecting that onto them. And so I thought that was interesting. But the neat thing about the drones is that they were actually played by these amputee actors. Like, there were 3 or 4 of them that played the 3 drones, and all of them had been were without legs. And so basically they're sort of walking with their hands. And so I thought that was something that was actually pretty cool. And so it definitely goes a long way towards adding some life to these robots. So that was definitely something that made the movie stand out from sheer uh, perspective of science fiction. um, but yeah, so I mean, this is just like, it's a movie that it stands out in the realm of science fiction, but also it stands out as a tragic character study of a well-meaning protagonist who sadly fell into the realm of villain protagonist. um, so a couple of things though that I will say that I guess you could say, maybe I'm nitpicking here, but they are flaws in my opinion. So we get dialogue from the characters about how bad life on Earth is, and there's this monologue that Freeman has that Bruce Dern passionately just nails out, right? But he's talking about how all the people on Earth are basically just stagnant and creatively sterile, and so it's like no one wants to dream anymore. And he's basically saying that they're like that too, as in his fellow crew members are. And so the thing is, from what we see of them, of his fellow crew members, I mean, they're the only other people that we see as far as, say, fellow human beings. And the most we get is some occasional contact from some other ship's captain or something like that, but it's over radio or something like that, or communications speakers. But they're the only other humans that we get to see besides Freeman himself. And while they do come across as a bit insensitive in regards to, say, the seriousness of the mission, and the goals and the hopes that Freeman has for preserving the forests and everything, like, they come across as insensitive, but they don't necessarily come across as inhuman or dead, like, say, he's describing humanity at this point, like creatively, mentally dead, because I mean, in their own ways, I mean, they do have some life to them. It's just that they don't see the point of preserving nature. So I think that as powerful of a monologue as it was for Bruce Dern to have for the character of Freeman, I think that maybe if we had seen that conveyed through, say, maybe the actors playing their characters, like his fellow 3 crew members, maybe if they had played their roles a little less, say, naturally human, if they had maybe, say, had a dead quality to their performance. I mean, not to a point where, say, like, their performances are one note and bad, but more like, say, they're just, you know, almost like zombies or something, like simply because, they've given up on, having a passion for living or something like that. Like if we'd gotten to see that, like, and maybe have it to where, Freeman was like that himself at one point, but in the process of, coming to care for the gardens and tend to them and the flora and fauna, maybe like he, experiences a reawakening and, actually starts to be what humanity once was in terms of, say, the emotions and the dreams and things like that. And, having him, you know, butt heads with, crew members that are, say, emotional zombies or emotionally zombies or something along those lines. I mean, that would have been interesting to see because, like I said, I mean, they come across as a bit insensitive at times, but they don't come across as, say, evil, and they come across as very human, just insensitive. And so I just wish that we'd gotten to see, humanity, conveyed in such a way to where the words and Freeman's dialogue might have more adequately reflected. But another thing though is that we don't get an explanation as to why the company or whoever is in charge wants to destroy the forests. And I mean, the one thing of dialogue that we get is some throwaway line about how they're wanting to repurpose the cargo transport ships for other missions or something along those lines, like something like that maybe is more that they consider to be more pressing, which kind of opens the door to a whole bunch of other questions, because if humanity is so bad off that nature has died, and yet they're able to create these spaceships that are able to go to other planets. I mean, that opens the door to, like, well, what about having gardens on other worlds and things like that? And do we know, if we don't really know though, whether or not humanity has been able to go outside of the solar system? It's like, obviously they're able to go to other planets, but we don't know how far out into space they're able to go. We don't know if there are other outposts of humanity on other worlds or anything like that, or if this was just sort of a Hail Mary play to see if space travel could have an effect on giving nature a second chance or something like that. So I do wish that they explained that a little bit more. But on the other hand, even had they explained that, I mean, it would have been, I think it would have been, better from the standpoint of, logic, if there'd been some reason that was given. I mean, granted, it would have to make some kind of sense, from the, standpoint of, cold corporate logic, but we don't really get an explanation other than, say, something about, the transport ships, them wanting to recall the transport ships, for other missions and things like that. So, as I remember someone, I forgot who it was, but was talking about it and saying that, maybe, things aren't, it's not just that, nature's dying out, but, things are so bad financially that, they sort of, did a pros and cons, look at things and came to feel that preserving nature was a waste of time and resources, and so they wanted to try using these cargo ships for exploration for other worlds or something along those lines. I mean, if they'd given us a little more detail as far as that goes, then I think maybe the actions of the company or the government or whoever would have made somewhat more sense. I mean, not to a point where we're no longer on Freeman's side or anything like that, but to a point where it's like, yeah, we just got these orders to destroy the forest, but we don't know why, but we got to do it because they tell us to, that kind of thing. So, but another thing though is, uh, they point this out on the commentary tracks, but when they're blowing up the domes, they're using nuclear explosives to do so. And the thing is, it's like, okay, if they wanted to just jettison the domes, I mean, okay, that's one thing, right? But to blow them up with nuclear explosives, well, you now have all this small debris floating throughout space now that's all radioactive. And so if they were wanting to float the reason of, say, the domes being a hazard to transportation or something like that. I mean, here's the thing, it's like the domes, it's like they're very visible. All you gotta do is go around them. If that's really the reason to get rid of the domes, or if they're wanting to say, if they had wanted to repurpose the cargo transport ships for other missions, they could just jettison the domes and let them, I guess, let the flora and fauna die out over time. But the thing is, they'd be very visible to the ship's sensors. So any ship that's going towards them could be like, oh hey, there's something here, let's go around it or over it or something like that. But with blowing the domes up, with nuclear explosives, I mean, there's a risk that any ship that's heading that way could suddenly get hit with radioactive debris. And not only that, but the crew of that ship could get sick with radiation poisoning. I mean, so yeah, it's one of those things where obviously we're definitely supposed to be on Freeman's side. And considering the nature of the story and the circumstances, I mean, that this is literally the last bit of nature that Earth has. I mean, we're definitely inclined to sympathize with him, and we're definitely on his side in that regard. But it just doesn't make sense as to why the government or the company, or whatever you want to call it, is doing what they're doing. Like, we don't know why they decided the experiment was a failure. We don't know why they decided to blow it all up instead of just maybe just jettisoning the domes and what have you. So yeah, it is one of those things where if you look at it real closely and try and take a strictly realistic logic to things in the movie, I'm not gonna say it falls apart, but it's one of those movies where it's kind of like there are elements of the plot that do not make sense, just from the standpoint of realistic logic and what have you. And so, but on the other hand, though, the fact that so much effort is put into realizing the tragedy of Freeman Lowell's character, and Bruce Dern just gives such a wonderful performance. Plus the amount of effort that went into, realizing, the world of the Valley Forge and everything, and just the amount of sincerity, that's put into, the message of the film, is something that kind of, counterbalances, the flaws of the, logic and what have you, because it's not meant to be, a straight up 100% scientifically accurate movie. I mean, it's meant to be a science fiction film, but with a with an impassioned message, imploring humanity to do a better job in caring for the environment and what have you. So this is something where don't shoot the messenger, because the message is actually something that is worth hearing. So yeah, I mean, another thing, one more thing I'll say though is that, you know, the fact that not only do we come to sympathize so much with Bruce Dern's character, but also with the drones, is something that is a sort of bonus, to the movie. It's a plus for the movie in my eyes, because when you have, supposedly non-sentient, robots, kind of, growing on us, to a point where, say, if something happens to one of them or more of them, and we feel it, it hurts. I mean, that's where it's like, okay, I mean, maybe these things were supposed to be inanimate, robots, but I mean, or non-sentient robots, but the fact is, I mean, they've grown on us. They've developed as characters in their own way, and so I mean, that's definitely a sign of good filmmaking. So you have, you know, a, a sort of crazy human, coming to terms with what he's done and the reality of the situation, but at the same time you've got these three robots that you know become just as important to us as Freeman is. So I mean, that's definitely a sign of good development in writing, especially in the realm of science fiction. So I'm going to go ahead and give Silent Running 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good movie, and you definitely go away thinking about it afterwards. And so, as far as like bonus material, I mean, it's once again, this is an Arrow Video Blu-ray release, and so you're going to get some good things here. You've got brand new 2K restoration from the original camera negative, approved by director Douglas Trumbull, and produced by Arrow Video exclusively for this release. So basically, a lot of the stuff, as I mentioned earlier, is not available on the previous release, which was a Blu-ray release, if I remember correctly. At least that's the last one I remember. High definition, Blu-ray presentation, original lossless mono audio, optional English subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, which definitely come in handy. Especially if you're watching the movie with the commentary, and you can still you have the subtitles on, so you can still follow the movie but listen to the commentary at the same time. Let's see, you have a brand new audio commentary by critics Kim Newman and Barry Forshaw, and you also have an original audio commentary by director Douglas Trumbull and actor Bruce Dern, and that was on the previous release. That was on the Blu-ray release that I was talking about earlier, or that I mentioned earlier. And so they're both really good audio commentary tracks. And so with the one with Douglas Trumbull and actor Bruce Dern, you have this sense of camaraderie of almost like two colleagues catching up on an old project after years of not seeing each other and what have you. But you definitely get an inside look as to what it was like to work on the movie. And so the movie's coming from the commentary is coming from a perspective of two people who are actually involved in the movie. So it's an informative track, but you also it's nice to see how proud both Douglas Trumbull and Bruce Dern are of the film, and the spot that it has in their respective careers. It's a highlight for both of them. And Doug and Bruce Dern was very complimentary of Douglas Trumbull's skills as a director, and he said that working with him was one of the highlights of his career. And Douglas Trumbull in turn is very open about his appreciation for Bruce Dern's commitment to the part, as well as the fact that the people that he worked with on this film were so gracious with him and so patient with him, because this was literally his first movie that he directed. And so so yeah, I mean, it's really cool just to listen to these two guys talk about the movie. So it's nice to know that it's cool to hear stuff about the movie and learn about the movie, but it's nice to know that it's something that they're both proud of as well. So as far as the commentary with the critics Kim Newman and Barry Forshaw, this is more it's less of an inside look at the movie and more of like a they're looking at the movie from, say, like a cultural perspective, and because they're talking about in comparison to, say, other movies of the time and what have you. And so it's you have a different perspective in their commentary track versus the other commentary track. So you get a lot of overlapping information, but the perspectives are different. But nonetheless, I mean, you have like two very informative and very entertaining commentary tracks. And so it's like you learn a lot about the movie, both as it was actually made, as well as, say, what might have been, or as well as say how it compares to other other standpoints in cultural history and when it comes to film. So let's see. You also have an isolated music and effects track, which I tried out, and basically it's kind of like, I don't know, background noise in a way, because I mean it's the whole movie, but there's no dialogue. But the dialogue has been sort of edited out to where it's just the sound effects and the music of the movie. So it is kind of like background music. So it was kind of neat in that sense. But you also have let's see. No Turning Back, which is a new interview with music historian Jeff Bond, and he goes into a lot of detail about the film's score. Both the composer Paul. Let's see, what was his name? Peter Schnickle, Peter Schickele, and Joan Baez, and the songs that she sang for the movie. And you learn some interesting things about how she came aboard, which also you learn about in both commentary tracks as well. But him being like a film music historian, there's a little more detail in that regard. But you also have First Run, which is a new visual essay by writer and filmmaker John Spira, exploring the evolution of silent running screenplay. And basically it goes into more detail of screenwriters Deric Washburn and Michael Cimino's original screenplay, which is certainly different, and I would say it's certainly a lot more violent in terms of say how Freeman ends up killing his fellow crew members. And so there is a certain violence, there is a certain intensity to the moment when he strangles his fellow crew member with the shovel. But at the same time, though, it's brief enough to where it's like, okay, I mean, it's intense, but it doesn't linger, that kind of thing. On the other hand, though, in this original screenplay, I mean, he just straight up, caves their skulls in, and it's pretty brutal. So they don't go into the whole screenplay, but they highlight the differences from how it started out versus how it came to be, and also the movie, at least the original screenplay, the movie was going to start off with Freeman just basically standing in the garden looking down at the crew members that he's just murdered, and then the film would go to a flashback, and then it would cut to the present, and then a flashback. And so in these flashbacks, that's how they would show, okay, how do we get to this horrible situation, in terms of say how do we get to this little bloodbath. And we get to see how Freeman and his fellow crew members got to work together and know each other and what have you, and how it came to pass that he ended up murdering them. So definitely it was certainly darker in that regard. And also the conclusion, while it's tragic in its own way in the original screenplay, I just feel like what they did with the actual movie did it so much better. I mean, and so it really has that sort of bittersweet quality to the conclusion. And you see the movie, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But it was fascinating to see how the movie was originally intended to be, at least with the original screenplay. Let's see, you also have give me a sec. The Making of Silent Running, an archival 1972 on-set documentary, and it's almost a feature-length documentary. I mean, I don't remember, I didn't clock it, so I don't know exactly how long it was, but it felt like a whole movie in and of itself. And it was cool because, I mean, you find this out in the commentary tracks as well, but it goes into more detail about how the ship, the Valley Forge, like the interior shots, were filmed on a decommissioned aircraft carrier that was also called the Valley Forge. And so they basically, filmed the whole movie. I mean, with the exception of the exterior shots of, the spaceships. I mean, the whole movie was more or less, most of the movie was actually filmed on this decommissioned aircraft carrier. And so, you have, little moments where, they're showing, well, okay, if you look right past, this wall here, you can basically see how, there's all this, material from the actual, ship and what have you. But Bruce Dern was talking about, during this little documentary, he was talking about how at the time, I mean, he is a pretty athletic individual, and he had very long hair and everything, and so he basically kind of looked like a hippie. And so basically, and he liked to run around and jog, but if he went beyond a certain point on the top of the ship, which is where he jogged, basically, he'd end up coming across, some of the movie people, like some of the production people and what have you, and some of the civilians, working, near in the area. And basically, he'd sort of, catch him off guard, because, I mean, here's this, long-haired hippie dude, running top speed at him. And so, just kind of, put people at ease, he had this, I think he said it was like a marker or chalk or something, that he would measure a certain distance of, how far, he could run, before having to turn back, so that way he wouldn't, catch, all these people off guard and startle them, and so, yeah, it's like, he talks about how he did that and everything, so that way he could still, decompress and get his exercise and everything, but also, he wouldn't freak him out by, looking like a deranged hippie running at him, so I thought that was actually pretty funny. But you also have, let's see, what else? Silent Running by Douglas Trumbull, which is a bit of a documentary that's, focusing specifically on director Douglas Trumbull, and he goes into, his special effects background and the aforementioned fact that his father worked in special effects as well. And so he sounds like a pretty cool guy, because, I mean, even though he had only directed, I think, 2 movies, he directed this movie and Brainstorm. I mean, this is a guy who really knows his stuff when it comes to filmmaking, like in terms of, say, creating special effects, and also just filmmaking in general. But then you also have Douglas Trumbull, Then and Now. And so, that's another interview. Like, they're both archival interviews with Douglas Trumbull. But the Then and Now was a bit more, recent at the time than the first interview, the Silent Running by Douglas Trumbull. So you get a lot of information overlap, but at the same time, I mean, you do see a guy kind of, with the second interview, he's, looking back more in hindsight, and that kind of thing. And then, let's see, what else you got? A Conversation with Bruce Dern, an archival interview with the film's lead actor. And so, if I remember correctly, that interview, plus the 2 interviews with Douglas Trumbull, had been included on the previous, on the DVD release. Because I actually remember, when I watched the DVD, I watched the interview. And Bruce Dern, I mean, much like, when he was doing the commentary with Douglas Trumbull, and when he's talking on the documentary of the movie, I mean, he gives a lot of background about the movie, but also about himself as an actor and what have you, and how much this film means to him, and how much it means to people over the years, and how proud he is to be a part of something that still has the staying power that it does. And of course, you have a theatrical trailer, extensive behind-the-scenes gallery, and a reversible sleeve featuring original and newly commissioned artwork by Eric Roper. So this is the artwork, the newly commissioned artwork by Eric Roper. That's Freeman Lowell from the back. That's one of the drones. And so you see it looks like a computer with 2 legs. And there they are, looking from the dome out at Saturn. And I love the rings that they put here. It's beautiful. So I like how there's like a certain amount of beauty to this picture, but with the darkness, the shadows and everything, it sort of says, I mean, yes, I mean, this is a beautiful looking world here, but there is a darkness to it in the sense of him running out of time, and so, but the original artwork though, let me take this out real quick. So this is what the original artwork looked like. Sorry, it kind of improvised, I admit, but so this is the original artwork. So I actually like both pieces. I mean, I think that the newly commissioned artwork, is a nice piece of, subtle imagery, with the, shading, conveying, the tragedy of the impending tragedy of the film, or just the overall tragedy of it. But this one, I think, just in terms of, detail, is better for, giving us a lot to look at. Because there's Freeman and one of the drones, working together to, plant something in the garden. And then you see, one of the ships, with its domes. So very good artwork. I always love this picture. So, but that is definitely one of the highlights of an Arrow Blu-ray release, is you get the reversible sleeve artwork. So you see something old and something new a good amount of time. But yeah, that was Silent Running. 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good movie, and I would say that if you like environmental science fiction and you want to see something that was kind of groundbreaking for the time, and is still relevant today in terms of the message that it has, I would say that it's a good companion piece to the film Soylent Green, which was from 1973, starring Charlton Heston. But that's another groundbreaking environmental science fiction film that came out in the 70s. And I would say that if you wanted to have like kind of a double feature night with environmental science fiction films, Soylent Green and Silent Running and Soylent Green would be a good double feature. And in fact, you watch both movies, and at least in my case, I feel like there's a bit of headcanon where there's a possibility that Soylent Green and Silent Running take place in the same universe, so because in Soylent, it's like the dialogue that you get in Silent Running about how bad life on Earth is because of the oceans drying up and the plant life dying out. It's like you hear about it in Silent Running, but you actually get to see it in Soylent Green. So that's why I feel like one, it'd be a good double feature to watch both movies back to back, but also just thematically speaking, they may as well be in the same universe, just maybe not taking place at the same time. So, but yeah, that was Silent Running. So thank you very much for taking the time to check out this review, and if you made it this far, I really appreciate you making it to the end with me. So if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And you got any questions, comments, I'd love to hear them. So y'all have a good night. Take care. Bye.